Great heroes. Embodiments of perfection. Masters of an era. A crowd of warriors stands atop a cliff, swords raised high toward the sky. These are the names that carry the weight of legends. A golden sword is lifted toward the light, and our tale is drawn into the heart of the medieval world, to the castle of the founding emperor, a leader among these legendary figures and the commander of the gathered masses. The emperor steps onto the balcony, rallying the crowd with a powerful speech. Among those assembled, we meet a variety of characters ranging from a hero celebrated beyond measure to a healer who has saved countless lives. They could not be more different from one another. Yet, amidst the praise, one man dark-haired and dressed in a simple white shirt stands apart. He clenches his fist, his expression filled with disdain. To him, these words of glory are nothing but hollow flattery. His mind drifts back to the moment a so-called hero, Savage B, mercilessly struck a child barely 10 years old. The blow sent the boy hurtling into a mound of sand, his small frame swallowed by it. Elsewhere, a tattered young man barely clings to life as he approaches a girl with a blue square-shaped ornament. She shows no compassion, instead casting him bound in ropes into a pit of flames. His face twists with terror, tears spilling down his cheeks, while hers contorts into a cruel smile. Every trial they inflicted, she claimed, was for the greater good. To the dark-haired man Davy, these great heroes are nothing but arrogant fools. With finality, he damns them all in his thoughts, bidding farewell to those gathered in the hero's hall. But before he can leave, 2 young women approach him. One remarks that he is still far too weak. The other, the cutie with the square, muses that her little sister should have thrown him into a magma-filled pool more often. Davy wonders why these so-called millennials call themselves his little sisters at all. At the mere mention of age, the girl with the blue braid erupts in fury, striking a stone with her fist and shattering it. Several people rush to restrain her while Davy, unfazed, covers his ears and smirks, further infuriating those around him. Eventually, the enraged heroes manage to calm the furious girl in the medical gown. Davy glances around. From the balcony, all the elites watch him closely. His crimson eyes widen slightly. He's oddly pleased by their reaction. They call out to him, asking not to forget them, even after he wakes. Davy listens in silence, barefoot, standing at the threshold. With a brisk step, he turns toward the door. The great heroes follow him with tearful eyes. For just a moment, his smile reveals genuine joy. As he approaches a cluster of light, he hopes their reunion will not be far off. He disappears into the glow. Darkness swallows the scene until one final blinding flash illuminates the space. A green stone floats within a container, surrounded by tiny bubbles, the liquid around it shimmering with an emerald hue. A catheter feeds that same green liquid into an arm. We shift into another reality, one where Davy lies bedridden, sustained only by intravenous lines. A breeze stirs the thin curtains. The frail hand gripping the sheet trembles. At last, the patient stirs from a long coma. His eyelids, heavy as lead, lift for only a moment, revealing an ornate chandelier above him. Exhaustion forces them shut again. Moments later, they flutter open once more, revealing a face pale and weary. His gaze drifts toward a family portrait. The painting shows a young boy hair tousled, eyes a striking crimson. Davy stares at the joyous face of the boy in the portrait and realizes the truth. He has returned to the world where he is the powerless, abandoned Prince Davy Allen. A map reveals the location of his home, the small and unremarkable kingdom of Ron, nestled on the continent of Thonis. Still lying motionless, he gazes at the portrait with a bittersweet expression, recalling the carefree days when life here was filled with luxury and ease. Dusk settled imperceptibly over the room, the fading light casting long shadows across the floor. A quiet melancholy overcame Davy as he reflected on his own naive behavior from the very beginning. Once, as a young boy living on modern Earth, he had believed that happiness was endless, unshakable, eternal. He had not yet understood the heavy price of bearing the title of prince. That ignorance shattered the day his mother was poisoned, her lifeless body collapsing to the ground in a scatter of pearl ornaments. From then on, danger became his constant companion. A suspicious carriage would pass too closely during his walks. A bowman's arrow once whistled past his head, the shot expertly aimed yet failing to end him. Even his own father, the king, refused to grant him freedom. Davy caught himself before dwelling too deeply on the past. Lying in bed, he resolved to make his recovery his first priority. Dawn broke while his mind still wandered. A sharp, bloodthirsty grin curled his lips as he vowed to give the mysterious rider who once tried to kill him a warm welcome, now that his body was far stronger after 1,000 years of training alongside the greatest heroes. Among the crowd, the figure of a long-haired boy stood out. His resemblance to that same rider was uncanny, green eyes glinting with pleasure, lips twisting into a predatory smile. The scene shifted to the world of heroes. There, young Davy sat curled in a clearing, quietly whimpering. A bare foot appeared behind him. Turning with irritation, he found a muscular man carrying a massive ham, smiling warmly. The man praised Davy for standing up to his offenders. Davy, looking away, snapped that he had spoken the truth and didn't care if others laughed at him. In his mind, memories replayed at first. Everyone had celebrated him, lifting him high like a hero. But when they learned he was merely an ordinary child, they began treating him like an insect. Watching the sunset, the man in the lion mask confessed he hadn't known Davy's true identity. Davy frowned, impatient with the conversation, and demanded to know why the man had sought him out. The masked hero explained that the heroes had taken interest in him, an ordinary boy with an unusual appearance, and had made a joint decision Davy hadn't heard about. Without warning, the muscular man lifted him by the scruff of the neck, calling him lucky. Confused, Davy listened as the hero revealed their intent to welcome him as one of their own. "How can we be a family if I don't even know any of you?" Davy asked. The lion-masked man introduced himself as Hercules, master of survival, a name Davy realized he had heard before. Without further ceremony, Hercules declared himself Davy's coach and carried him off, still dangling by his shirt. The scene returned abruptly to a grand chamber. A glittering chandelier swayed overhead. Davy, still bedridden, drew a slow, surprised breath. The liquid surrounding the magic green crystal was nearly depleted. Closing his eyes, he accepted the truth he was truly back. Beyond the room lay a magnificent castle of red and green tiles, with long corridors and towering spires. The camera's gaze climbed to the highest point of the keep, where pale light streamed through a half-open door. Davy lay sprawled across a large bed, freshly awakened from his long slumber, while a maid quietly replaced the emerald-colored healing solution at his bedside. She was the only one who ever came to him. Dressed in a simple black gown with a white apron, her thick red hair neatly braided into 2 pigtails, she worked in silence, her hands steady as she arranged the container of medicine. Davy explained her solitary presence to himself by the fact that he had been in a coma for so long. Still, the absence of any other visitors unsettled him. As she finished her task and wheeled away the wooden cart, the darkened room seemed to swallow the sound of her footsteps. Alone once more, he felt a quiet sense of gratitude. At least someone had been assigned to care for him in this state. When he was certain she had left, Davy cracked one eye open. There was no one else in the room. With great effort, he lifted himself slightly. His body trembled under its own weight, and his hands shook with weakness. Even this small motion was exhausting. Still, he needed to know the date. On his nightstand sat a calendar one from this alternate world, following Baldy's reckoning. His gaze locked on the year, 276. 6 years had passed since his injury. 6 long years stolen from him. The memory struck without mercy, the sharp pain of an arrow burying itself into his back, the grass beneath him soaked in blood, and the shadowy outline of a rider just beyond reach. His jaw tightened, lips pressed into a thin line. He would never allow such a thing to happen again. But first, he had to reclaim his strength. Raising his hand, he clenched his fist, willing his body to heal the way it might in a game instantly, with magic. Nothing happened. The scene shifted to the world of heroes. Davy, seated cross-legged on the marble floor of a grand Greek-style temple, sparks of magic dancing at his fingertips. A tall woman with a long braid regarded him calmly, explaining that while his sacred power was only average in quantity, his potential was unmatched. He scoffed, asking her not to try and inspire him with empty words. She explained that sacred power, also called the power of God, was a force of healing and purification. A priest and a floating, ethereal woman clasped hands in prayer, filling the space around them with holy radiance. It was the same power often bestowed as blessings upon pets and the faithful. Saint Daphne herself, renowned for accepting God's grace, had once taught Davy to wield it. And wield it he had after 100 years of training, mastering sacred power despite its limited supply. But here, in his weakened body, the magic refused to respond. For a moment, he feared none of the skills he had honed in the Gallery of Heroes had transferred back with him. Relief came when he realized most of them had returned with his soul. He simply needed to force his body to obey. Gritting his teeth, he tried again. Still nothing. Frustrated, he muttered a threat at his own unresponsive arm, and then, finally, it worked. A faint shimmer of light bloomed near his hand. Ethereal wings spread briefly, bathing the room in radiant glow. A grin spread across his face. Using the sacred power to stabilize himself, he leaned against the nightstand and pushed to his feet. The world felt different standing upright again. He moved along the wall, savoring the triumph, and as he passed the tall windows, a sudden gust burst through, flinging the curtains into the air like weightless silk. Davy stood before the open window, his gaze fixed on the breathtaking view beyond. The sun blazed in a crystal-clear sky, and the wind ruffled his hair. Warm light washed over his face, and he closed his eyes in quiet bliss. Slowly, with a carefree grin, he stretched his arms wide, savoring the moment. Then, with the unrestrained joy of a child, he called out a greeting to the sun, utterly unbothered by how ridiculous he might look. His moment was abruptly interrupted by the sharp crash of a plate shattering on the floor. Startled, Davy turned to see a familiar maid frozen in shock. She stared at him as if seeing a ghost, unable to comprehend how the young prince, supposedly bedridden after a prolonged coma, was now standing at the balcony, alive and well. Before Davy could greet her properly, she rushed toward him in panic. Moments later, the court physician, Ramses, was at his side, stethoscope pressed to the prince's chest. Listening intently, the old doctor's surprise was plain. Davy's recovery was far beyond what anyone could have expected. When asked if he felt any pain, Davy merely smiled and admitted to a bit of fatigue. Ramses stroked his gray beard with a warm smile, clearly relieved. Inwardly, Davy reflected on how he might once have been indifferent to such kindness. But now he recognized the man as a part of the royal household serving the Ron family, to which he himself belonged as the firstborn son of Queen Rinialad and the reigning king. The peaceful moment ended with the arrival of a woman in a yellow robe, her fan snapping shut as she entered. Her cold eyes swept over him, clearly displeased to find him alive. This was Queen Lind Beretta, the woman who had poisoned his mother. Standing beside her were her two children, Prince Callus and Prince Benedict, the second and third heirs to the throne. Callus's green eyes gleamed, his smirk barely hiding his surprise at the first prince's unexpected vitality. With a sly grin, Queen Lind asked whether Davy had seen who tried to shoot him. Playing the fool, Davy replied that the assailant's face had been impossible to see. Then, fixing his gaze directly on Callus, he remarked that whoever dared to attack a member of the royal family would surely face severe punishment. Beads of sweat formed on Callus's brow, though he tried to mask his unease. The queen quickly stepped in, claiming the matter was too old to pursue. Davy's eyes lingered on Callus for a final, disdainful moment before Ramses completed the examination, prescribing routine checkups and medication. The doctor left with the maid in tow. Once they were alone, Lind made no attempt to hide her venom. She remarked that it would have been better had Davy died. He responded with biting sarcasm, wondering aloud if she was disappointed the eyesore remained. Callus attempted to humiliate him, reminding him that his coma had been the result of an attack, before calling for his younger brother. Together, the queen and her sons left, the chamber doors closing behind them. Davy stared at the shut doors, certain they relished dragging the kingdom into disgrace while hiding their own involvement in assassination attempts. Raising his hand, he resolved to use his sacred power to heal, confident that no one in this world could detect it. He sank back onto the bed, his thoughts drifting once more to Queen Lind Beretta and her son Callus. Once, he had intended to kill them without hesitation, but after centuries spent in the Gallery of Heroes, such revenge now seemed almost trivial, a notion that brought the faintest smile to his lips. Davy tightened his grip on the bedspread, his voice steady with conviction he was not abandoning his pursuit of revenge. The thought of food momentarily distracted him, and he struck a pose reminiscent of an ancient philosopher lost in deep contemplation. Outside, the streets were bright and clear. Inside, dark strands of hair lay scattered on the floor, remnants of a recent haircut. With his new look, Davy trained his body, using the backs of chairs as makeshift exercise equipment. A month and a half had passed since the awakening of his holy power. Now, his legs trembled with the strain of each movement. He ended his workout, wiping the sweat from his brow, reflecting on how monotonous the days had been. Yet, through the fusion of necromantic mana and sacred power, his recovery progressed smoothly. At first, healing magic alone had been remarkably effective, but mastering the knowledge of necromancers and the healing techniques of Sister Ha from the world of heroes had made restoring his body almost effortless. With a snap of his fingers, Davy summoned purification magic. Water swirled into existence, lifting his feet slightly from the ground. Cleanliness enveloped him, and he smiled, remarking on how practical such magic was for daily life. His thoughts were interrupted by Amy, the palace maid, who arrived with his meal. She lifted the lid, revealing a dish that instantly dampened his anticipation. What he had hoped for was a proper meal. Instead, the offering resembled a pale orange mash better suited for a toothless elder. Amy glanced away shyly and apologized, explaining there was nothing else she could do. Davy ate regardless, spoonful after spoonful vanishing quickly. Declaring one portion insufficient, he demanded 5 more. Moments later, with the plate empty, he decided 10 servings would be better. The maid stood frozen in disbelief. Even when Davy thought himself full, his stomach seemed capable of holding 3 times its usual amount, likely a side effect of recovery magic. After the feast, energy surged through him. Contentment lasted only a moment before a far more urgent matter presented itself, one that required a trip to the toilet. Determined not to break the image of an ailing patient, he moved slowly, leaning on a crutch. Good digestion, he mused, could sometimes be too good. Later, seated with glasses perched on his nose, Davy studied a royal document. Amy apologized again for the poor food, but he assured her she was not at fault. While continuing to read, he asked how many servants remained in the palace. Her silence, accompanied by a faint blush, told him the truth: she was the only one. Looking around the well-kept room, he began to grasp the dire state of the palace. He inquired about its budget. Amy, still guilty, explained they received 6,000 gold pieces annually, but only 10 remained. When he asked about the monthly allocation, she admitted that although 500 gold pieces had been requested, no more than 100 ever arrived. Curious about her pay, Davy learned that despite 6 years of loyal service, she received only a third of her rightful salary. Shock flashed in his eyes. He thought her both kind and naive. From her manners, he could tell she came from a noble family, yet her hands bore the marks of years of labor. In addition to tending the sick, she had taken on every dirty task required to maintain both the prince's care and the palace itself. Amy stood before him, her posture deflated, her eyes uncertain. For 6 long years, she had worked alone, surviving on a meager salary that had recently been cut even further. Davy, seated behind his desk, regarded the maid with a warm yet resolute expression. He dipped his quill into ink, signed a royal document, and instructed her to take the full amount of her rightful pay. She blinked at him, stunned. "Why, you mean all of it?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Don't make me say it twice," Davy replied, still writing. "And stop calling me Prince." He set the quill aside, reached for his crutch, and rose from the chair. Looking directly at her, he added with a faint smile, "When you call me that, it feels as though we're strangers." Amy's face flushed, her thoughts a tangle of confusion. They made their way to the palace treasury, its tall wooden doors looming before them. Davy leaned lightly on his crutch, gazing at them with open admiration. A bittersweet thought crossed his mind: his father had not once visited him since he'd awoken from the coma. Amy cast him a wary look, silently warning that such talk could bring trouble if overheard by the royal family. But in this moment, they were alone. "I'm sorry," Davy said softly, noticing her unease. "I never meant to drag you into anything. Just stay close and keep your eyes forward." Inwardly, he had already decided. A man who did nothing when the queen was poisoned was no family of his. Amy offered to escort him directly inside, her cheeks still faintly pink. He studied her with quiet admiration. "Take care of me," he said suddenly. She hesitated before nodding. Inside, the treasurer awaited them, a man in a bright green tailcoat, his powdered wig curled in stiff, elaborate fashion. He twirled a thin mustache between his fingers while addressing Davy with rehearsed politeness. His eyebrows lifted in guilty acknowledgement as he explained the difficulty of securing more than the prescribed funds. Yet his words seemed only a veil for mild alarm, betrayed by the restless twisting of his mustache. Davy's eyes narrowed. The treasurer's manner grated on him, but he held his composure. Amy stood to the side, her green eyes wide, her expression caught somewhere between confusion and concern. The prince turned from the man, his gaze falling on a stack of books, though it wasn't the books that had caught his attention. Behind him, clerks shuffled by with papers in hand, while others peered nervously from behind the banister of a high wooden staircase. The treasurer leaned forward with a sigh, clearly irritated, his glance drifting sideways toward Davy's blue robe. Davy moved to a plush sofa and sat, arms spread across the backrest, watching the mustachioed official with open disdain. A sheen of cold sweat gathered on the treasurer's brow. Sunlight spilled through tall windows, glinting off ornate furnishings as the treasurer began his lengthy explanation of the royal budget. Davy did not interrupt, but his displeasure was plain. Two onlookers hovered nearby, while Amy lingered farther back, still unsure of how to respond. Finally, Davy exhaled sharply. "Don't test my patience," he muttered, eyes half shut. From the far side of the room, a low murmur rose, the faceless crowd whispering among themselves about the state of the palace and the disgraceful mismanagement of its funds. The words reached the treasurer's ears, and his polite mask faltered. Brows drawn tight, lips curling in irritation, he cast a sharp glance toward the distant gossips, his composure slipping under the weight of their derision. The man in the green tailcoat clenched his fists, his mouth twisting with frustration. Across from him, Davy sat on the couch with hands folded neatly in his lap, posture poised, expression unreadable. Amy, meanwhile, seemed intent on vanishing into the furniture, keeping her gaze low and presence minimal. The treasurer, sweating nervously, stammered through his explanation, insisting that the repair issues fell under the Department of Housing Management, not the Treasury. They merely handled budget distribution, he mumbled. With a sharp crack, Davy slapped his knee, startling the bureaucrat into a trembling hunch. The man's fingers twisted anxiously at his worn mustache as Davy remarked that, on Earth or in this world, it was always the same, everyone blamed someone else. The financial manager's forehead glistened with sweat as he peered up from under his brows. Davy, smiling faintly, took hold of a crutch to lift himself from the couch. He called for Amy, announcing that his business with the Treasury was concluded. As they approached the exit, Davy cast the treasurer a sidelong glance laced with disdain. The man assumed the prince was heading straight to the housekeepers, but Davy turned, leaning gracefully on his unnecessary cane, and dismantled that notion with a few cutting words. He suggested the treasurer put the stolen royal funds toward something useful, anything at all. The color drained from the man's face, his eyes widening as his hands seized his mustache like a lifeline. Once outside, Davy allowed himself to admire the palace in the warm light of day. He and Amy walked at a leisurely pace down a long, sunlit corridor, his mind wandering over the decadence of the aristocracy and the fate of the servants who had fled. His thoughts shifted to Amy's quiet burdens, only for her to turn toward him with an expression so imploring it bordered on pitiful. With a sudden change of expression, Davy asked her to bring him a sword, his lips curving into a wide, almost foolish grin. Amy froze, her green eyes widening in horror. The sight made Davy laugh heartily. He teased her, asking if she truly feared his request. She stammered that she would fetch it and hurried forward, while Davy followed, twirling his cane with a mischievous smile. As they moved, he swung the crutch in a wide arc, grazing the surface of a grand portrait of the acting Queen lens. The impact left a clean, semicircular slash across the canvas. Satisfied, he planted the stick before him with a resounding thud, inspecting his handiwork with pride. Resting one hand on his hip, Davy mused that he wasn't about to start indiscriminately cutting people down, but then again, perhaps there were certain people worth cutting. In his mind, the scene shifted. He stood amid a blood-soaked floor, an immense sword in his hand, crimson droplets streaking across his impassive face. He imagined what would happen if he began slaughtering servants within the palace walls. The thought was simple people would say the prince had gone mad. In this vision, blackened hands pointed at him from all sides in condemnation. Tilting his head, his blood-smeared cheek caught the glare of a pair of brilliant, merciless red eyes. The fantasy darkened. His hair whipped in a phantom wind, maroon petals swirling in the air. Blood dripped from the blade, splattering into shapeless stains on the ground. And then, with a final, cold resolve, Davy decided he would not become sustenance for the rotting aristocracy. The carcass of a wild boar lay sprawled across the palace lawn, its thick hide glistening under the afternoon light. Prince Davy stood over it, wiping the sweat from his brow as he caught his breath. Behind him, the snow-white walls of the palace gleamed. Amy, frozen in shock, stared at the scene with wide eyes and parted lips. Davy, however, remained calm. He explained matter-of-factly that he had found the animal nearby and simply brought it back to the palace grounds. Kneeling beside the carcass, he instructed her without even turning his head to fetch water, herbs, and food from the storeroom. Inwardly, he admitted the lie. If he claimed to have killed the boar himself, few would believe him. Suddenly, Amy's composure broke. She rushed toward him, shouting that she would rather die than see the prince's hands sullied with the blood of a beast. Davy half turned in disbelief, his hand still resting on the carcass. When he asked what was wrong, tears welled up in her large, puppy-like eyes as she insisted that the hands of royalty should never be stained with such work. Davy thought wryly that his hands were hardly the only part of him bloodied in life. His very being had been steeped in crimson long before this moment. Amy pressed on, insisting that the prince mustn't butcher the animal, lest he injure himself. Davy idly twirled the knife in his hand, his expression light and unconcerned. "No one's here to see," he said. Behind him, Amy covered her face and gave a muffled cry. With the tip of his tongue caught between his teeth, Davy began to carve into the boar. Blood pooled on the grass, dark and thick. His mind wandered to his father, absent from the last reception, to Queen Lind, quietly plotting the first prince's assassination, and to the unyielding strength of his own body. Leaving the knife embedded in the carcass, Davy turned toward Amy. Dressed in his seasoned hunter's garb, he winked and flashed her a thumbs up, as if posing for a portrait beside a prized kill. In his mind, no crisis was fatal as long as one had the strength to fight back. Night fell over the palace, the sky alive with stars. A dark silhouette stood at a high window. Inside, a blindfolded maid knelt on the floor, her posture tense. Before her, Queen Lind sat fanning herself with sharp, measured motions, displeasure etched into her features. She thought of the boy hated, changed beyond recognition after his coma, and her lips curled in distaste. The maid, her voice low and careful, suggested that Davy was still recovering. But Lind's mind lingered on the troubling reports from his tutors about his rapid progress. Rising, her gown whispering across the polished floor, she paced in thought. "How likely is it," she asked, "that he will not recognize the spy sent to him?" The maid remained silent, her hands tightening around the fabric of her apron. Lind tilted her chin upward with the tip of her fan, calling her shy as she voiced her unease. The queen spoke of Shy's connection to the Black Moon, an underground mercenary guild based in the capital of the Ron Kingdom. It was not distrust that stirred her, but an unshakable anxiety. Meanwhile, Davy, fresh from his coma, hair overgrown, sat with his back turned. In Shy's eyes, he was unchanged, the same first prince abandoned even by the king, suspended between life and death for 6 long years. When Davy turned to meet her gaze, his red eyes narrowed into a brazen smirk. Lind's grip on him, she knew, was tenuous. Anything could happen. Her expression darkened at the thought. Shy bristled, defending her subordinates and warning the queen to stop insulting them. Lind regarded her sharply, then masked her irritation with a polite, false smile hidden behind her fan. Glancing at a teacup on the table, she remarked coldly that Davy could be eliminated at any time. She lifted the porcelain cup to her lips, her tone grim as she warned that if the agents failed in their mission, they would pay dearly for it. Lind, still holding the cup, allowed a thin, ominous grin to spread across her face. She replied evenly that she would take the queen's words into account. With a casual flick of her wrist, she emptied the tasteless tea onto the floor. The pale liquid spread across scattered burgundy petals, staining them like an omen. The queen, already turning to leave, delivered a final, cutting remark, "Better to rid oneself of a dog that refuses to obey." Her voice lingered in the air even after she disappeared down the dimly lit corridor, accompanied by another figure. Shai, walking beside her, murmured that the queen's command would be enough when the right moment came. At the royal dining table, Davy sat in apparent bliss, preparing to sample a dish made from his latest hunt. He speared a morsel of meat with his fork, only to send his maid into a silent panic, her hair practically bristling at his unpredictable behavior. The scene shifted to the realm of the great heroes. Streams of mana shimmering in vivid blues and reds coursed through an intricate channel like the root system of an ancient tree. Little Davy was asked if he understood the explanation, but his attention was fixed entirely on his own hands. The girl in the green dress, her voice edged with amusement, teased him about remembering her advice and urged him not to die during the process. The reserved girl with loose purple hair was clearly offended by the comment. It was explained that the bold girl in green was Aoz, a necromancer. Alongside her stood an archmage in a worn witch's hat, carrying nothing more practical than a staff, and a quiet girl in a medical gown. Davy turned to Sister Haas, who had calmly taken full responsibility for the mana experiment. Despite his attempts to protest, the healer extended her hand toward him with absolute confidence, asking for his trust. Standing in a dreamlike vision within the familiar gallery of heroes, Davy realized the moment had come to repeat an experiment so dangerous he had sworn never to attempt it again, even under the threat of death. After a long breath, he placed his hand in Sister Haas. The sky beyond was streaked with drifting clouds, the sun breaking through in warm shafts of light. Trees wore their greenest foliage, and a tidy pile of twigs lay in the grass. Amy stood at the forest's edge, her hands clutching the apron of her dress, calling gently to the prince in the royal garden. Davy emerged from the thickets with an unguarded smile, dusting off his dress shirt. He relished the pleasant weather and the excuse to disappear into this local jungle. With a conspiratorial tone, he asked Amy not to reveal his location to anyone. She listened with a soft smile, and he noticed how much more at ease she had become in his presence. He recalled their recent lunch and allowed himself to believe his attempts at building trust were finally working. Placing a finger to his lips in playful secrecy, he stepped backward into the dense foliage. Amy, still smiling, mimicked the gesture. Sunlight streamed through the canopy as Davy seated himself cross-legged on the grass, closing his eyes to focus. Around him, faint honeycomb patterns of sky-blue light shimmered into existence his operating field. Within it, golden motes of energy drifted lazily before streaming toward him. Mana spiraled around his body, inhaled as naturally as breath itself. Through a method devised by Odin, the god of magicians, Davy absorbed only the purest essence of mana from the world around him. Davy sat in the golden glow of his mana, strengthening the very core of his body's vitality. The energy coursing through him demanded careful discipline. Mana had limits, and its reserves could vanish quickly if squandered. His hand rested lightly on his leg as he employed his unique absorption method, a technique so efficient that he could gather in mere days what would normally take months to accumulate. He remained perfectly still, eyes closed, feeling the magic saturate every fiber of his being. Elsewhere, in the vast library, rows of towering bookshelves were patrolled by robed magicians, their pointed witch hats casting long shadows, a quiet testament to their mastery of the arcane. If the entire continent could wield the kind of power Davy now possessed, the devastation would be immeasurable. But Davy had no intention of sharing his secrets with the world. A sudden rush of wind lifted his tie into the air, whipping through the clearing and flattening the grass. Leaves spiraled upward in the whirlwind. From the corner of his eye, Davy caught sight of a shadow lurking in the branches overhead. Turning toward the rustle, he called out with dry sarcasm, asking who was hiding in the thicket. The trees swayed, scattering leaves across the ground. Without hesitation, Davy strode out of the clearing, already suspecting the spy had been planted by the queen. Rather than anger him, the thought brought a grin to his face. This kind of surveillance might work in his favor. Let them think him a harmless fool. A faint glow caught his attention from within the bushes. His grin widened. He had gathered enough mana to begin. Hidden in the undergrowth was a magic circle and artifact etched with strange inscriptions, glowing with concentrated light. Davy withdrew to an ivy-covered gazebo, leaning against one of its pillars. Though sacred power, magic, and necromancy were normally incompatible, he had mastered all three. From the shadows, 3 silhouettes emerged. The tallest bore a long braid. Another wore an oversized witch's hat and carried a staff. The third was draped in a full-sleeved gown that concealed her hands. He recognized them instantly, mentors from the hero's gallery. Among them stood the sharp-tongued necromancer in green, the black-clad archmage with an eye patch, and 2 more peculiar figures, a calm, long-haired mage with violet locks, and a healer in a medical coat whose poise radiated confidence. The memories alone were enough to make Davy press a hand to his mouth in faint nausea. Turning his head, he recalled how ordinary magicians formed a circle within their hearts to channel mana. But Davy's method was different and infinitely more dangerous. With a sharp exhale, golden ribbons of energy unfurled beneath his feet, rising and twisting upward. He explained, at least to himself, that if he had followed the usual path, his heart would have ruptured instantly. Instead, he used an intricate network of channels to guide mana throughout his entire body. Red streaks traced across his face as magic coursed through his veins, blending sacred power with spirit mana in perfect harmony. The veins in his bare feet glowed with golden light as the completed magic circle surrounded him, intricate symbols spinning in the air. In his hands, a translucent, glowing ring of fine, needle-like patterns shimmered. He had always avoided this method. Its risks were too high, its margin for error too thin. Now, rainbow-colored rays burst forth from an unseen source, bathing him in lethal beauty. At the moment his confidence wavered, ephemeral hands soft, transparent gently enclosed his own. He lifted his gaze to see 3 ghostly figures smiling down at him. His mentors, come to bolster his resolve. His breath caught for just a moment before his expression shifted. The soft smile faded into a confident, defiant grin. Davy steadied his breath and gathered his courage. With deliberate precision, he began the blood-linking ritual. The power of the magic circle surged to life radiant as a miniature sun held in the hands of a hero, its light spilling far beyond the garden walls. The glowing pattern expanded, consuming the space around him as dusk deepened and the first stars emerged above the palace. Against the fiery backdrop of the setting sky, Amy stepped into the garden. Her green eyes scanned the distance, uncertainty clouding her expression as she wondered where the prince had gone. On the lawn, a small cart stood waiting, dinner prepared, plates arranged for the evening meal. The maid hesitated, torn between waiting and going to search for him. Her voice trembled as she whispered her fears aloud, worried that something might have happened. From the shadows came an unexpected reply, a voice telling her not to call him Prince. Startled, Amy's eyes widened and her lips parted in surprise. Davy emerged from between the hedges, calm and composed, raising a hand in greeting. As he approached, his tone carried a hint of irritation. Why was she waiting for his return again, despite his request not to? Amy began to defend herself, but Davy sighed and shook his head. A faint, warm smile touched his lips as he acknowledged her resourcefulness, admitting that he still had much to learn himself. Then, without warning, he slipped an arm around her. Amy froze, unsure how to react. Her cheeks flushed a deep, vivid purple, and her eyes grew wide. Closing his own eyes, Davy murmured an apology, then slumped forward, exhausted, resting his head against her shoulder. He soon lay across the hem of her dress, unresponsive to her anxious words. His breathing was steady. He had simply fallen asleep after a grueling training session. Later, beneath the ornate chandelier of his chamber, Davy stirred. His eyes fluttered open, only to widen at the sight of Amy asleep in a chair beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Turning his head, he understood she must have stayed the night, still worried after his collapse. Across his skin, the intricate channels of magic like crimson lightning were perfectly formed. 3 forces now coursed through him, blue, gold, and red, intertwining in harmonious streams. A soft breeze drifted through the curtains, scattering motes of sparkling magic and faint, golden feathers into the air. Amy stirred and lifted her gaze, the first thing she saw being Davy seated on the bed in his blue lab coat, gazing out at the morning light. The ethereal feathers drifting around him were his biscast magic, their delicate forms catching the sun. "Good morning," he said softly, as a transparent feather floated past the open window. 5 months later, sunlight poured through the dense canopy of palace gardens, spilling over the blue-tiled roofs and white stone walls. In the courtyard, Amy carried a heavy bag, her lips curling into a small smile as she found it filled with medicinal herbs. Nearby, Davy shaded his eyes from the bright midday glare as he tied up a bundle of provisions, a 3-month stock of groceries. His face no longer bore the strain of exhaustion. Instead, there was a quiet satisfaction in his expression as he allowed himself a faint smile. 3 months earlier, he had stood before Amy, who sat with the same bag in her lap, and reflected on the changes since completing the canal circle. Life had grown more stable, though curious happenings followed. Someone had begun leaving fresh meat and vegetables in the palace courtyard. At first, Davy suspected Queen Lind, who often appeared in her yellow dress, fan concealing her face. But the food was ordinary and harmless, and eventually he abandoned his suspicions. Now, when he thought about the mysterious helper, his expression turned thoughtful and warm. One night, golden mana encircled his eye as he peered through the darkness, catching sight of a stranger slipping food into the palace grounds. Through the streams of magic, he recognized the figure, and though he could watch her unseen, Davy decided that spying on Amy any further would be an intrusion on her privacy. Davy studied the golden stream of sunlight drifting past his face, his single open eye following the slow movement. Along the paved road ahead, several pairs of boots marched in unison. Holding a walking stick loosely, he glanced toward Amy, who stood among the trees with a bag in her hands, her smile bright. He asked her to see to the preparation of the food they'd received. Without leaning on the cane, merely carrying it, Davy turned sharply and left the garden. Over his shoulder, he told Amy that guests would soon be arriving at the palace. She blinked in surprise, calling after him for an explanation, but he only smiled. At the king's gate, 3 figures appeared, monks, or so they seemed. 2 wore matching blue robes, their faces eerily alike, while the man at their head stood out in red and black garb, his triangular beard giving him a sharp, fox-like aspect. Davy recognized them instantly, puppets of the queen. Inside, a decorative shield and swords display adorned the wall, the golden light glinting off the metal. A monk in a black robe grasped Davy's wrist, holding it out as he examined him. Once finished, Davy, sitting on his bed, asked how soon the man's sacred magic could restore him. The monk's answer was cautious after such a long coma. Divine healing might harm rather than help. Davy smiled faintly, his thoughts disagreeing entirely. To him, the man was simply bending to authority, unwilling to act. Leaning on one arm, Davy studied the priest with cold amusement. He remarked that ailments like his could be cured through the blessing of the goddess Priya, a method he preferred. The monk's tone hardened. He accused Davy of ignorance, then smugly compared him to his half-brother, Prince Callus, clever and extraordinary, unlike the stupid Davy. Amy, unable to remain silent, scolded the man in outrage. The monk's eyes narrowed with disgust. With a sharp, theatrical motion, he struck Amy across the face. Her ornate clock pendant fell to the floor. Turning away from Davy's bed, she pressed her cheek, her eyes blazing. The priest, wholly pleased with himself, lectured Davy on how to handle a maid who dared to interrupt. Amy's cheek burned red, but her defiance remained. Noticing her beauty, the monk seized her chin with a white-gloved hand and leered, his tongue wetting his lips. Disgust rippled through her, but before she could react, Davy threw off his blanket and began to rise. Seeing this, the priest remarked that if Davy could walk, he should take short strolls around the grounds. Behind him, Amy stood motionless, the fallen clock still at her feet. The monk declared the examination complete and set their next meeting for 2 weeks later. Davy instructed Amy to escort the guest out, which she reluctantly agreed to do. The corridor outside glowed under the light of a golden chandelier. The priest's boots halted before Amy, trapping her against the wall. His hand rested near her face as he leaned in, ordering her to come alone to him at night or else Davy's life would be forfeit. Amy's eyes widened in fear. The monk's gaze was predatory, his smirk cruel. Calling her a fool for defending a pathetic prince, he left her trembling in the empty corridor. The hilt of a lone sword rested in its wall mount, its matching shield long gone. The clock and table still lay overturned, and a jagged crack split the stone floor, stretching from Davy's bedroom door deep into the hall. Fury surged through him. With one hand, he held up his shirt. With the other, he gripped the sword he had taken from the wall. Energy glowed faintly along his legs as he strode forward with determined purpose. Ahead, two monks in identical robes spotted him and began shouting, their voices full of outrage. Davy didn't slow. In his mind, annoyance was the seed of growth, and anger the engine that drove it. A smile curved his lips. By the time silence fell, the monks' lifeless bodies lay sprawled in the corridor beneath the glitter of a golden chandelier. Nearby, Priest Bort had cornered Amy, pressing her against the wall to block her escape. His hand rested theatrically against his chest as he claimed the queen would praise him for killing the prince. Amy's brow furrowed in defiance, her mouth tightening as he added that Davy had no allies in the kingdom. With a self-satisfied grin, he spread his arms, boasting of how dearly Queen Lind valued him. A low, deranged chuckle interrupted his monologue. Turning, Bort found Davy perched casually on the windowsill, eyes alight. The prince told him he had merely been waiting for the right moment, then leapt down, blade in hand, driving the priest back. Davy moved to shield Amy, the sword's point aimed at the man now sprawled on the floor. "What's the penalty for insulting the royal family?" Davy asked without taking his eyes off his prey. Amy blinked, startled but heartened by his arrival. Bort, cornered and bleeding from a split cheek, glared in confusion. Where did this boy's strength come from? He snarled and drew his own blade, but Davy's expression didn't waver. "I don't need the filthy magic of a worm like you," he said coldly. Amy, with the prince's jacket draped over her shoulders, hesitated before answering his question. "Death," she said at last. Without a flicker of hesitation, Davy drove his sword into the priest. Blood darkened the stone as Bort clutched his throat, coughing and gasping. He managed to choke out that the queen would never allow him to die like this. Davy stood tall, a heroic figure framed by the sunlight streaming through the window. Behind him, Amy looked on in awe. "Then it will be the queen's turn next," Davy said, his voice steady. An angry shout echoed down the hall. A stinging slap struck his cheek the queen herself, furious beyond measure. Pointing her fan at him, she called him a madman. Davy's only reply was that the priest had threatened his life, and he had acted according to the law. Lynn's rage deepened. "Stop your clowning," she snapped, raising her hand to strike again. Davy's tone was calm, almost thoughtful, as he remarked on the irony that instead of praise for upholding order, he was met with her wrath. The maid behind him looked utterly bewildered. Smiling faintly, Davy asked when the royal family had begun allowing lowly clerics to soil their lineage's name. The question left the queen momentarily off balance. Her fan lowered, but she quickly recovered, accusing him of challenging the authority of the crown, her gestures sharp and cutting. The queen's voice was sharp, laced with scorn as she continued to berate Davy for killing the priest. With venom, she compared him to his late mother, calling them both foolish. Davy's reply was cold, almost detached. He saw no shame in resembling his mother. Queen Lind masked her displeasure behind a bright fan, calling both the prince and the late queen plebeians. The insult ignited a quiet fury within Davy. Fixing her with a dangerous stare, he warned her that it was a grave mistake to speak ill of a child's parents in front of them. The queen faltered, her composure cracking, as Davy advanced, his sword flashing in several restrained swings that made her flinch. Before he could close the distance, chains lashed around him. 3 maids armed with blades stepped between the queen and the prince, while a 4th courtier appeared behind Davy, restraining him. Shackled, Davy glanced sideways and let out a sardonic chuckle upon spotting Shani, the blindfolded maid. He remarked dryly on such unwavering loyalty, his words dripping with irony. The queen, rattled, kept herself hidden behind her armed attendants. Davy, clearly unimpressed, suggested it would be far more interesting if her guards stepped aside. With a sigh of feigned boredom, he sat down, crossing his legs in a white armchair. His tone carried the weight of an unspoken threat execution, perhaps for the attempt on his life. Queen Lin's anger began to dissolve into unease. Cold sweat clung to her as she wondered if Davy knew the truth, that it had been Callus who nearly ended his life 6 years ago. Davy's smile turned mischievous. Calmly, he assured her he knew everything, and that he was not so foolish as to reveal his trump card before the right moment. Leaning on one hand, he mocked her lack of tact, raising a hand against an ill man, no less. He ordered her to keep the palace quiet, adding with satisfaction that even the servants seemed to be slipping away one by one. His casual musing about what rumors might circulate about her only deepened her fury. Her lips twisted in rage. She hurled a vase to the floor, the crash sending water and tulips scattering across the polished surface. Surrounded by her loyal maids, Queen Lind clutched her head, screaming in frustration. She collapsed to her knees, overturned furniture framing the chaos. Her laughter rang out suddenly, unhinged, as she pushed herself upright. If the prince wished for a quick death, she declared, she would gladly oblige him. Her voice shook with rage as she urged him to keep pushing boundaries, to keep stirring trouble, tightening the noose around his own neck. The scene shifted to the grand beauty of the castle. Polished floors gleamed beneath delicate shoes as courtiers whispered in hushed tones. In the corridor, Amy hurried past with a large brown bundle in her arms, slowing just enough to overhear fragments of gossip. But when the onlookers noticed her, the whispers died abruptly, and she slipped away into a quieter wing. In another chamber, Davy sat in a white chair, one arm resting on a small table, a book open before him. His eyes scanned the pages, though his thoughts wandered. He was well aware that rumors of his madness had begun to spread through the castle. In the corridors, most voices sided with Queen Lind, and his reputation had fallen sharply. Yet, when he finally lifted his gaze, his large green eyes sparkled not with worry, but with something far closer to delight. Amy's voice rang with cheerful excitement as she pointed to the large bags behind her. Davy, watching her with a soft smile, couldn't help but be amused at her enthusiasm. Beads of sweat trickled down her forehead from exhaustion, yet she remained bright-eyed. Praising her strength, Davy remarked that he no longer needed medicinal herbs. The maid, still brimming with energy, announced with pride that someone thought highly of him. Holding a book in one hand and adjusting his glasses with the other, Davy closed it gently, turning his attention fully to her. He asked, almost playfully, if she truly thought he was a good person. Amy didn't hesitate. Her answer was a beaming yes. Her joy was so sincere that Davy found himself wondering how someone who had once witnessed him commit murder could treat him with such kindness. In his imagination, her expression even sprouted dog ears and a wagging tail. The moment was interrupted when a white-haired man with a mustache and thick brows appeared, one hand resting on his belt. Behind him, knights and a crowd of people filled the garden. The chief chamberlain, Visos, stepped forward from the shadows of the greenery, announcing that he had gathered the culprits on Queen Lin's orders. Before Davy knelt a group of servants, once loyal members of the household who had fled with stolen gold from the royal treasury. Now they bowed their heads, trembling with guilt. Among them, Davy recognized familiar faces. Adjusting his glasses, he inquired of Visos what the punishment for embezzlement and desertion might be. The old man replied that the sentence was at the prince's discretion, though even blood relatives were often executed for such crimes. Their desperate pleas for mercy brought only a flicker of contempt to Davy's face. He addressed the group calmly, noting that a rumor had been circulating that he was obsessed with bloodshed. Watching fear ripple through the crowd, Davy allowed a small, satisfied smile. "Then I'll simply live up to it," he said. With his hands folded, his voice remained steady as the criminals begged for his compassion. He turned away from them, speaking to Visos over his shoulder. His orders were cold and precise. The thieves were to be locked in the dungeons without a drop of water, prepared for execution. Though he disliked that this was all by the queen's command, he decided to play along, even adding with mock pleasantness that the executions would be carried out in 4 days. The wails for his mercy only grew louder. Later, in a richly furnished room, the topic of hiring new staff arose. Davy requested that Amy be promoted to head maid, citing all she had endured. Setting his glasses neatly beside his book, he then asked Visos whether an audience with the king was possible. The chamberlain frowned, explaining that he only relayed orders and could not say. The answer soured Davy's mood. but he acknowledged Vsauce's advice to be patient. As Vsauce prepared to leave, Davy halted him with a comment. He was eating well, had sufficient medicine, and needed no further assistance. His circumstances had changed. The old man studied him in puzzlement, lowering his brow in thought, wondering who might be rewarding the prince's apparent kindness. Then, with some urgency, Vsauce excused himself, mentioning that a guest awaited Davy. That revelation sparked a hint of concern. Davy idly traced a spiral of blue magical energy with his finger, glancing down at his hand. His thoughts lingered on Vsauce, the man who served as head of the royal household staff, the king's trusted chamberlain. Davy had often crossed paths with Vsauce in his childhood, but he never imagined that anyone in the palace apart from Amy might truly be on his side. Resting his chin on his hand, he idly twirled a stream of mana between his fingers, lost in thought about something the old man had said regarding the visiting guests. Just then, the door cracked open, and a red-haired girl with pigtails peeked through, addressing him. Davy, startled from his thoughts, responded, and James introduced the visitors, the fourth prince and the second princess. The doors suddenly swung open with such force that they struck the maid behind them. In an instant, hands reached for Davy, who sat in a chair with a book in his hands. Both the book and his glasses went flying as Princess Winry, green-haired and brimming with enthusiasm, threw herself onto him, sending them both to the floor. Davy lay still, face down, causing both Winry and Amy to panic. But before the princess could fuss over him further, a tall young man with matching green hair seized her by the scruff of the neck, lifting her effortlessly off the ground. This was Varus, Winry's twin brother, who had just entered the room. Smiling at Davy, he remarked that it had been far too long since they'd last met.